All right, just a moment. We're getting ready to stream live.
Oh, what was David? David is just a photo of one of my staffers.
I don't know what's happening with Jeffrey Tumlin. Hold on one second. So weird. I need some help.
Oh, Megan, can I start the webinar? Because it says like...
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay, everyone. Welcome to the community discussions from Hearsay Media. Just give us a couple of minutes. We'll be getting started shortly. All righty, we are all here. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. All right, folks, good evening. And thank you for joining us virtually for Community Conversations, brought to you by Hearsay Media. My name is Megan Mitchell, and I'll be your moderator. Tonight's discussion is focused on transportation and will cover what engagement should look like in communities of concern. In case you have not heard of Hearsay Media, we are a multimedia platform ran by a team of fellow San Franciscans who believe in the power of our city. We think that San Francisco should be a shining example of urban inclusion, and we hope to empower you with the information you need to hold yourself, your neighbors, and your city accountable through our reporting. To check out some of our stories, visit hearsaymedia.org. Now, before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to start by setting the intention for this space. When it comes to race, equity, and inclusion, these types of conversations are hard but necessary. With that, I'd like to share with you and the speakers these discussion norms that were put together by the Office of Racial Equity. And a big shout out to Director Shakira Simley for putting these together. Let's take a moment to review. All right. Now, before I introduce tonight's panelists, I'm going to give you a brief background on the purpose of tonight's conversation. As some of you may know, San Francisco streets have seen a dramatic change due to the pandemic. In the past year, we've introduced programs like Slow Streets, a car-free Upper Great Highway, a car-free portion of McLaren Park, and a car-free portion of JFK Drive. Now there are talks about making some of these initiatives permanent. And while these are popular initiatives, there are concerns that not all San Francisco's residents are being informed or given the opportunity to lend their voice, particularly communities of concern. Recently, our president of the Board of Supervisors, Shamann Walton, spoke out against the car-free JFK initiative, calling it a segregationist policy. He followed up with an op-ed where he talked about recreational redlining, which sparked a lot of response from community and a response from supporter of the closed roadway, David Miles from the Church of Eight Wheels, who wrote that there is no such thing. And of course, there's a lot happening on social media. So whether we agree or disagree with President Walton or David Miles, as San Franciscans, I think we all can agree that there is a disconnect between our city agencies and some of San Francisco's communities. In fact, we at Hearsay published a Q&A with President Walton where he specifically called this out. While we may not have it all figured out by the end of this conversation, what we will have is perspective and future conversations. Now, I'd finally like to introduce our panelist, Executive Director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, Tilly Chang, and Director of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, Jeffrey Tumlin. Thank you both for being here. And also joining me is Stacy Randecker, fellow District 10 resident and a big-time bike advocate. I want to give my panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Tilly.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much for having me. And I look forward to this opportunity to be in dialogue with you and all the members of the public who I hope are able to participate in various ways. Did you want us to go beyond just a simple introduction? Happy to do that.
Oh yeah, well yeah, tell us a little bit about your role and how we're working towards this.
Yeah, certainly. So the Transportation Authority, for folks who may not know us, is the other transportation agency here in San Francisco. We are the sales tax administrator for voter-approved half-cent transportation sales tax funds, as well as many other funding sources. And we administer those through our board, which is the 11 members of the Board of Supervisors, sitting as the Transportation Authority. And we provide funding and coordination and planning on behalf of San Francisco. Many of our sponsors are agencies that you all would know well: SFMTA, BART, Caltrain. We also provide funds to Public Works for things like street resurfacing, the Planning Department, SF Environment, all according to a voter-approved expenditure plan. We also provide coordination and facilitate planning and project development on freeways. So pretty much any facility touching San Francisco in terms of surface transportation. We also serve as the sort of planning staff and or project development or policy staff to our board. And in the case of some of the topics we're talking about tonight, our board did ask us to lead a study for the Golden Gate Park access study. And that's a request that Supervisor Fewer made as she was ending her term on the board late last year to facilitate a working group to help advise and inform the implementing agencies decisions that would be then forthcoming as to how to design JFK Drive. And that's something that we've been in the process of doing for the past several months. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Another assignment that we got was from Supervisor Marr, and that was to work on the Upper Great Highway decisions around what that long-term future should be after it had already gone to car-free during shelter in place. The question is what should the long-term design be? And so we have been taking the lead on that study. It goes beyond facilitation of a working group. It's really it's more of a traditional study where we're looking at various alternatives according to a set of criteria. We've been holding town halls together with Supervisor Marr and have had public surveys and the like. So both studies are partnerships, of course, with the city agencies, including SFMTA and Rec Park and other agencies as well. So that's hopefully some context for tonight's conversation.
Thank you so much. Director Tumlin?
Thanks, Megan, and thank you so much for hosting this. I'm so glad that we're able to have some discourse on a very complex topic, and I appreciate you hosting. So I'm the director of the SFMTA. We run Muni, and we manage the public streets for the public good for all modes of transportation. Our role in Golden Gate Park is really in support of the Recreation and Parks Department, who manages the streets of Golden Gate Park. There are a set of streets that we do not manage, and we are supporting them and the TA in analysis about improving access for everyone to be able to get to Golden Gate Park. It is in many ways the flagship park of San Francisco, and it's everyone's park. It's not just a neighborhood park. And we need to make sure that everyone has access, particularly people who have the fewest mobility choices. During COVID, we've also had to pivot very quickly. We've experienced dramatic changes in travel patterns, big changes up and down in our finances, and also the need for people to be able to be outside and exercise with social distancing, something that we have tried to do all over San Francisco with our Slow Streets program, as well as with programs like we assisted Rec Park with in building a park. Now that we're approaching, the light at the end of the COVID tunnel, it is now our responsibility to take the studies that SFCTA did early on in the pandemic, the higher level studies, and complete that work in more detailed analysis, and in particular, to do more directly engaged community engagement on these very controversial topics. It's our position that neither the previous condition of JFK, which was one of the most dangerous streets in San Francisco, that the previous configuration was not acceptable, nor is the current configuration. The current configuration of JFK was done in a kind of slapdash manner with limited materials and very little public engagement. It also didn't consider in detail all of the access needs for the eastern part of the park, as well as the many institutions that are in the park, or all of the ways by which San Franciscans get there. So we know that a lot of work needs to be done. And we want to make sure that folks understand that it's not a binary choice, because neither of those options are particularly very good. And there are many opportunities to expand access to Golden Gate Park, particularly, again, for those with the fewest mobility choices. And that's our commitment, to carry the TA's work forward so that ultimately the Board of Supervisors can make a decision on what the final package of access improvements should be for the park, because that is their responsibility, not ours.
Thank you so much for that. So before we really start, getting more into this, I'd like to, Tilly, if you wouldn't mind explaining to folks what communities of concern are.
Oh, certainly. So that's just a term that has been sort of defined to mean communities that are majority, minority, and low income, or one or zero car households, or headed by single head of household families. So these are the more vulnerable communities, monolingual as well. I think that the strict definition, though, has to do with income and race. But there's variations of this definition, and it's increasingly important in our planning and our policy work, because there's a recognition of the deep disparities in terms of many, many aspects. But in transportation, we documented these in our 2013 countywide plan, where we sort of looked at everything from safety statistics, who is suffering the severe and fatal injuries in the city, transit outcomes and transit sort of performance, road condition, any number of dimensions of transportation infrastructure or services, and health outcomes, especially that can be traced back again to transportation, such as safety. So when we established that there was a deep disparity in many of these areas, working with all the different agencies of the city, we identified different strategies, and MTA did its own work, its own uni equity strategy, which was excellent, and they keep updating it every 2 years, right, Jeff? And we've all been working to close some of those gaps. Now, have we accomplished that? No, there's a long way to go. But I think number one, having maps, having studies with data and numbers, and being led by data is absolutely critical. And understanding that data is not the full way to express needs. In fact, we need the lived experiences of communities who are struggling and who have these perspectives that are super valuable. So we enabled a whole program called the Neighborhood Transportation Improvement Program, where we put funds out there for every district supervisor to prioritize, to create not only the project pipeline, but the planning pipeline, because the plans is where the projects come out of. And we identified that there was a planning sort of gap between sort of more privileged communities and those who are has less capacity, to not even participate and show up in a meeting, much less really drive it forward and ensure that the recommendations actually get funded. Now we have city, state, regional, federal dollars that are set aside for communities of concern and communities of color And there's a recognition that we have to structurally fix this. So there are increasingly more and more pots of funding that are looking for, projects that meet this, this goal of reducing these disparities. So we're constantly trying to set up our needs through community-based transportation plans, such as what SFMTA has done recently in the Bayview, and then deliver on those. Our agency also did a D10 mobility study for then Supervisor Malia Cohen. So everything from community shuttles to, we've actually funded several things such as an ambassador program on Muni, as well as navigation to health clinics using some Lifeline funds. These are all things that the community identified and prioritized, adding more OWL service to the 44 with Lifeline funds. And I believe this weekend as well, we'll be celebrating some new quick build bike lanes that SFMTA has delivered with some of the Vision Zero quick build money. And these all came out of recommendations from the community and MTA's Bayview transportation plan. So it's a small example of how it's starting to work, but by no means are we even at all there. Like we've also at Supervisor Walton's request, we put together the T-15 bus study. And of course that has resulted in a new service, the 15 Bayview Hunters Point Express that Muni launched earlier this year. And that again responds to planning needs that are finally being, after many, many years of being expressed, being heard, and the plans are being done, the funds are being found to do things like that. There are many, many other examples, but we're still at the early stages of truly kind of comprehensively looking at this, not just in that one community of concern. There are, I think, 8 or 9 in the city, across the city. So everything from Chinatown and Western Addition to South of Market to the Ingleside neighborhood out on the west side. There are very clear needs, and not just our agencies in the transportation sector, but the whole of the city, I think, is very committed to acting on these disparities.
Great. And this is a question actually both of you can answer. How are we considering the West Side transportation system holistically? If we want to keep the Upper Great Highway closed and JFK closed to cars, have we done a traffic study to understand impacts?
Yes, so the Upper Great Highway study is currently happening. And again, our website at sfcta.org, if you search Great Highway, hopefully it will pop up in the context of the District 4 mobility study that I mentioned Supervisor Mar requested. That study is currently in the evaluation stage. So we've identified not only the pre-COVID traffic patterns and some data collection that we did during shelter in place, during the car-free Great Highway. We've identified the benefits as well as some of the impacts. So there've been, I think pre-COVID, some 20,000 car trips, and those are being now handled on other streets, particularly the Lower Great Highway, the Sunset, 19th Avenue, and Lincoln and Sloat have always been heavy, and they're heavier in some places. We've also seen 5,000 or 6,000 people a day, being able to enjoy, I think it's, at least 5,000 or 6,000 a day, and maybe 30 some, if you look at those full 7 days, because the weekends are more popular for people walking and biking and scootering and enjoying the Great Highway. So we've been able to document some of these conditions, an array of criteria, the open space, the transit, the traffic, some of the other costs that do go along with each of these configurations. And if you look on the website and if you look on the evaluation in the town hall that we just held, you'll see some data to sort of compare 5 different options, for everything from keeping it as it is car-free to going back to the way it was to, sharing the right-of-way in different ways or by time of day or day of week. Really, those are the options that we've looked at. And that data is meant to at least give everyone a sense of the trade-offs and to acknowledge that there are some trade-offs and that there's mitigations that would be required. In fact, we've already funded some of MTA's efforts that they're putting out there, I think, as we speak, to traffic calm Lower Great Highway. And that's in direct response to clear conditions out there and also neighborhood and resident feedback.
That's right. And now that the TA has done all that great framing work, it's now our task to do the detailed work on mitigations. So we understand kind of the costs and benefits. So how can we mitigate some of the downside, for example, around traffic? It gives us the opportunity to accelerate projects we've long wanted to do, like a traffic signal at Lake Merced Boulevard and Sloat, which is a terrible intersection for all modes of transportation. It's also an opportunity to manage traffic better on Lincoln, including signalizing some intersections, which would have the benefit of improving pedestrian connectivity into the park, along with improving auto traffic along Lincoln, as well as improving the connectivity to Sunset Boulevard, which is this giant 6-lane arterial that just dead ends at Golden Gate Park that we can take better advantage of in order to substitute for some of that traffic from Parade Highway. In addition, it gives us the opportunity, as we're developing the recovery plan for Muni, to rethink some of the West Side transit lines, like the 18, which is currently out of service. It's a low frequency line that runs along 46th Avenue up to the Legion of Honor. And it lacks a regional transit terminus at the south end. So could we give it a better anchor in order to justify a greater frequency, to give West Side residents more choices, and also recognize that travel patterns have changed dramatically and COVID has accelerated that. The transit system right now is structured primarily to give people a one-seat ride to their office in the financial district. That is not the travel pattern in COVID, and it's just an acceleration of regional travel demand changes that have happened over decades, where the bulk of the job growth is not in downtown San Francisco, it's south of San Francisco. So it's giving us the opportunity to really rethink the whole demand pattern for the West Side, also keeping in mind that the Great Highway is literally falling into the sea, right? It's not going to be there for much longer. So can we prepare for a more resilient future by making smarter investments now, and also connecting every neighborhood to every other neighborhood where you can feel safe, taking your 8-year-old or your grandmother on a skateboard or a scooter or a bike or a wheelchair from your neighborhood to any other neighborhood in San Francisco. So we like taking a holistic approach in order to create more choices for San Franciscans, particularly San Franciscans with the fewest choices now, and to also emphasize the modes of transportation that take up the least amount of space. So San Francisco is growing, and I know that when I'm driving a car, I take up 10 times as much space as when I walk or bike or take Muni. And so, yeah, sometimes we all need to drive, or sometimes many of us need to drive, those of us who have licenses and access to a car. But it's the mode of transportation that wastes the most street space in a city where street space is extremely constrained.
Thank you so much for that. So the issue has been, I mentioned earlier, the op-ed from Supervisor Walton that talked about this being recreational redlining, that there being lack of outreach to his district. I want to know, and Stacy, feel free to chime in on this, what can we do to better connect our residents from District 10 to the conversation about making things permanent? How do we bring D10 and D11 to the table? Have we thought of anything since all of these articles have been coming out? Just curious what you guys think of that.
Yeah, Megan, thank you for that question, because we certainly understand the feeling that the perception that these are all backroom decisions that might have been already made. But let me just be clear, no decision's been made on Golden Gate Park, JFK, nor Great Highway. So these are both active studies. There's a slightly different approach to doing the studies. So for example, we did have a working group, 24 folks who are advising us on the Great Highway, on the JFK study. And we did have seats for D10 and D3 representatives in Chinatown and in the Bayview Hunters Point area. We did try, our staff tried several times to try and find folks to serve on the working group, but organizations that are in these communities are very busy and just super tired and very, very committed already to basic other needs that are time consuming. And so we weren't able to, have a community representative, unfortunately, in these two studies. However, I should say that the issues were lifted up by other working group members and by our staffs. So, discussions about the 43 and the 44 and how it takes forever, we've been talking about that. And I'm sure that the Rec Park and SFMTA team will be taking that into consideration in the next stage of work. We know it's not ideal to ask folks to come to us. So what we've been doing increasingly is going to the community, and that's both of our agencies, I would say. And, offering to go to them where they're already gathered for other meetings, the Southeast Commission or the Bayview Hunters Point CAC, or paying organizations to organize, co-creation sessions. We've been doing this particularly with our congestion pricing study that our agency is also conducting, and paying the participants for their time to participate. And that's absolutely, needed, I think, and appropriate. Both agencies, I think SFMTA did this in the Bayview transportation plan as well. So that's a best practice. It's still not enough. Not everyone has Zoom. Not everyone has a computer or time to participate. So we've been trying other means, such as text-based surveys, flyering, working with food pantries, working with churches, trying to table. It's not easy. It's never enough, especially in a pandemic. But we heard from our board members loud and clear, that whatever we're doing, talking about these big changes, and people are really just focused on survival in some cases and unable to participate. So we are potentially also slowing down our congestion pricing study, just in recognition of all the stress that households are undergoing, as well as businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, so that we can have the capacity and have a better opportunity to engage perhaps after things have eased a bit.
So I'd like to, or go ahead, Stacey, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So something that I have the luxury of not working in the transportation industry. I just get to be an advocate who dreams, and but I'm also one who's concerned about climate change and traffic violence that we suffer disproportionately from out here in D10. And I can't speak to not having a seat at the table, because if forever, and if I really wanted one, I'd find a way. And that's just not the case for people that live in Bayview Hunters Point. But to that end, I would say I'd much prefer that we had no community input in terms of closing our streets, but complete community input in terms of, now what do we do? Because the question isn't necessarily, should we close the street or not, but how do we get people to access all the good things our city has? And so take a survey of Bayview Hunters Point and ask how many of them have been on the Great Highway, how many of them have been to Golden Gate Park, period, let alone on car-free JFK. How many of them have been able to experience that? I don't think it's a very large number. And so the whole idea that we're talking about, we're worried about close it or not close it, it's like, no, close it. But how do we get them to experience these things? And I wish someone from Rec and Park had been here, because the other thing is, how do we get more of that in D10? Why should you have to spend, go 5 miles away, which is, half the length or more of our city, to experience these things? Why aren't the slow streets there? Why isn't the open space there? We need access for people in D10. And anyway, I'd like to know what you think about that, because I think we spend so much time asking people a permission to do these things, rather than what do they need? What is their solution? How can we solve it for them? Because that to me seems much more compelling than to close or not to close.
So let me add as well. So first of all, Megan, I wanted to thank you for the interview that you did with Supervisor Walton in Hearsay Media. which one of the panelists in the chat said was offered a lot more nuance to the issues. And everything that President Walton brought out in that interview, I agree with. San Francisco has a very, very long history of people like me downtown making decisions on communities that don't look like me. Some of it well-intentioned, some of it very much not. And I've learned even in my short time being here in San Francisco that it is critically important to not just rely on the data, but as Tilly said, understand the lived experience of the people that you're supporting in your work. We had the experience on the 27 Bryant, where the data said one thing, but the community pointed out the critical importance of the stop at the foods code, which was the place with the lowest price healthy food within a reasonable distance of the Tenderloin, and a critical location that they were disconnected from that we would have never known if we hadn't have actually talked with community. And we very much had the same experience in the Bayview community-based transportation plan, which was very much community-led. Community made decisions about how to prioritize the city's limited resources in order to achieve their local goals, and gave us really clear direction about how do we use transportation in order to advance community goals. And now we're working hard at trying to follow through with those commitments by actually going through and checking off every single commitment in that plan before suggesting something else to the neighborhood. And I think those lessons apply very much to Golden Gate Park, which is why I've insisted that it's not a binary choice. We should not go back to the way things were. We should also not keep things simply the way that they are. We should do, as Stacy suggested, ask the question, how can we best facilitate access to Golden Gate Park for people with the fewest mobility choices? Also keeping in mind, what they'd be doing in the park. So if you're going to barbecue in Golden Gate Park with your family, how do you carry your barbecue on Muni or on your bike? And so we need to understand how people want to use Golden Gate Park. At the same time, we facilitate access to other fantastic parks like McLaren Park and support Rec Park's initiative for a spectacular new waterfront park in Bayview at India Basin. So I think it's a yes and approach that leads from understanding what community needs and priorities are, and use that as a means for helping to best allocate the city's limited resource in order to best achieve community needs.
And that said, one of the things that, again, is at the heart of setting up those plans is just being able to find community partners who can convene folks, and they're wonderful. There are hidden gems, and really we need to celebrate them more. But these organizations, these community-based organizations, have been playing this role in a number of our studies: Tenderloin, Little Saigon, Chinatown, the Excelsior, Bayview, Hunters Point, and we'd love to be able to build up that capacity. In the Ingleside, it's coming together as well under Supervisor Safai's leadership. So how do we perhaps even this is a structural deficit, again, in our city. So how do we potentially imagine a solution? We are undertaking at our board's request a reauthorization of our sales tax, sort of effort to kind of plan what some of these investments might be. And maybe we should be considering ways to build in this capacity, this layer of capacity that CBOs can really help us and guide us. Co-creation is not about doing planning for a community, it's doing it with a community and being led by the community. But is there capacity there, and how do we build on the folks who are already doing the good work? And we can't keep asking them to do more. We have to just, clone them and force multiply them or help them expand sustainably. And so that is an interesting question that we would love to get feedback from everyone on as we're trying to put together our reauthorization expenditure plan priorities.
That's right. And that's usually the first step in any community engagement plan, is starting with the community-based organizations that we know and asking their advice about how to best structure engagement in a way that is respectful of people's time, because there's so much change happening right now that the burden placed on community-based organizations is enormous. So how do we make the engagement effective and worth their time? How do we get them the resources that they need in order to respond correctly? And who do they know? Because things are, the landscape is constantly changing, and usually they can give us fantastic advice for structuring effective outreach that is meaningful and gives us actionable results.
Could I make a suggestion? The one thing that is difficult is, Theodore mentioned it in the chat, is that if you live in D10 or D11, you have little to no example of what a slow street is. And if you see it, it is nothing that would actually be representative of an effective slow street. So is it possible to, when we're talking about these things, to have an outing so that people can go experience what these places are? Because how can they advocate or ask for it if they've never experienced it themselves? And again, the asking if we may close the street is going to outrage a number of people, no matter what neighborhood you go to in the city. It cuts across every socioeconomic class, every race, culture there is. There are going to be people who say, how on earth are you going to do that? That's crazy. And then there will be another group of people that will say in those same communities, I want that. I want that for my kids. And so, but on the west side of town, you have examples of these and people experience these. And so you may even have naysayers who have been converted, but we don't have that over here. So it's, again, a matter of the access. So can you get people to experience these things so that they can understand what it is and what you're proposing to bring to their neighborhood or in the city? And so get them to it and then bring it to them. And then if there is fallout in terms of their transportation needs, then that's how do we make this happen? Is it increased shuttles? Is it subsidizing muni fares even further? Is it, safe bike routes? What is it? Bike rentals? There's so many things. And that to me is a great starting point for the conversation, as opposed to sitting blindly and saying, hey, do you want this or not? Well, I don't know. It sounds like I'm going to lose. No, I don't want it. Anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you so much for that, Stacy. So let's be clear about what slow streets are in San Francisco. I was talking to Director Tumlin about this the other day, and I actually thought that the car-free JFK was a slow street. It is not. It is not under the jurisdiction of the MTA or the CTA. They're there to support and provide data and do the outreach and things like that, right, Tilly? So I think a lot of people make that mistake, including myself. And then we'll talk about slow streets. Go ahead, Tilly.
No, absolutely, you're right. It's not a slow street per se. I think we call them open streets early on. But JFK is owned, it's a roadway in JFK under the jurisdiction of the Rec Park Department Commission. Our latest understanding, however, is that as far as the approval of the permanent configuration, I should just clarify that there will be an approval role for the Board of Supervisors, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, in addition to the Rec Park Commission, and I believe SFMTA perhaps as well. So there's multiple jurisdictions, including the SF Board of Supervisors, for both JFK Drive as well as the Upper Great Highway.
So if people want to support these initiatives, then is it fair to say the best thing to do would be to write a letter to their supervisor?
At the time that we are at a decision point, yes, I would say. Until then, feel free to do that, of course. Reach out to your representative, but we can also be of help to you at the staff level while we're going through the study process. And again, the Great Highway is ahead of the JFK. Great Highway is at the evaluation stage, and we'll be wrapping up our TA study in the next month or so, and then handing it to, again, Rec Park and SFMTA to develop the next steps. In the case of the JFK decision, our working group study will probably be wrapped up in the next month, and we'll bring it to our board to accept. Thereafter, the citywide outreach and design process will be led by, again, SF Rec Park and SFMTA.
That's right. And so we're just trying to put some materials together to begin at least having a web page for the process on JFK. Tilly, can you put in the chat the website for the District 4 mobility study and Upper Great Highway? And so, right now, because there's no decision, there's no question really that's being posed. It's not a, keep it the way that it is or go back to the way that it was. We're looking at many different changes throughout the West Side, and there's some additional work that will need to be done along with a lot of engagement. So for the moment, I think the best thing to do is to catch up on the District 4 mobility study that Tilly will be posting. And then stay tuned for the JFK work, which will be interrelated in some ways with the District 4 work.
Okay, I got a question from the audience. How do we structure engagement in a way that respects people of all backgrounds without letting the privileged people off the hook? Is that even within the purview of SFMTA or SFCTA? I know.
Well, so this is a common problem that we face in community planning in San Francisco, that the process tends to be dominated by a small group of people who understand the process and know how to show up and how it works, and speak at our board meetings and whatnot. So a huge part of the staff work that's necessary is trying to connect with just regular San Franciscans, not the people with greatest privilege or greatest power. And that oftentimes means showing up where people are, like doing tabling at a supermarket or doing a meeting at a church. It also means doing data collection and surveying so that we can understand what the bulk of people think rather than merely the loudest voices. And that is hard because it's the loudest voices who are the loudest voices. And so at a staff level, we try to expand the pool. And that is another critical role that we use community-based organizations for.
Great. Did you want to add something, Tilly, before I go to my next question?
No, that's well put. Again, we understand the dynamics, and I think decision makers are also aware that the loudest, we should not equate loudness or volume with the actual needs of the community. So, but that is a good thing to remind everyone of, that again, it goes to who does have the resources and the ability to participate in the formal process. But what we try to do is ensure that when we have working groups, or if we are going, again, trying to go to community meetings, whether it's a CAC in the community of the CAC types that I just mentioned, or taking the process to the community is the best way to go. It does take a lot of resources. It does take a lot of time, and to translate everything in the multiple languages of the city. That is absolutely something that is now a standard practice. So that is hopefully helping, but it is a really big challenge. We also try to reach people, say doing a text survey along the Gary 38, which was putting the question in the actual posters at the shelters, right? And saying, text here. And so, that's another way to get input from busy people who are just trying to live their lives.
Great, thank you. I want to pivot a little bit to slow streets and talk about that process. I think some folks who may not necessarily understand slow streets, or probably are just walking around their community and seeing them, don't quite get how that process works. What is the process for requesting a slow street? What is the purpose of a slow street?
Sure. So slow streets were one of the programs that were born in the early days of COVID, when when we cut 40% of muni service, left entire neighborhoods without muni service, and where we were experiencing a lot of crowding on sidewalks around the city. So we started in the Sunset District because that was the neighborhood that lost the most muni service, and where the distances were longest, both to neighborhood commercial as well as to transit. And the approach was really simple. We threw up some barricade signs that said no through traffic. Cars are allowed on all of our slow streets. There's no parking loss on any of our slow streets. Everyone can drive to their garage. But the intention is to signal to motorists that they're guests in this space. They're not the owner anymore. And that they should expect people on foot and bikes and scooters and skateboards and wheelchairs to be wandering around in the middle of the street. In practice, we've seen a broad divergence of results. We have some slow streets that are phenomenally popular and successful, and others that have really struggled. And the common elements of successful slow streets are that they are relatively narrow residential streets, typically with one lane in each direction. The most successful ones are all flat. None of them is really required for through car movement. The most successful ones are neighborhoods that achieve a sort of minimum density threshold that allows there to be kind of enough people to start activating it. But most importantly, the most successful ones have a strong sense of community stewardship, because the resources that we put out there to create them are a bunch of flimsy signs and they blow over in the wind. And so the successful ones have included neighbors kind of making their own signs and propping them up when they fall over or get moved by irritated motorists. But most importantly of all, the most successful slow streets have a lot of kids on them, because there's something phenomenal that happens in the human brain, and it's physiological, that causes us to all behave a lot better in the presence of children than in the rest of our narcissistic San Franciscan lives. And so streets like Sanchez and Lake and Shotwell and Page are really thriving. Others are kind of iffy. We had a slow street in the Bayview on Lane that didn't really work, in part because people didn't really quite understand it. And we kind of went out there and tried to explain, and it was a sort of failed experiment that taught us that how you implement slow streets is just as important as the design. And so we went back to the drawing board, and if you go to the Slow Streets program page that I put into the chat, you can click on the phase 4 slow streets, where we've identified neighborhoods that, where slow streets didn't emerge from the community, based, from the supervisor and from neighborhood associations, whenever, basically most of them came from community clamoring, where we went and did additional engagement work in community to look at what are the streets that met the physical criteria, the most problematic of which is actually emergency response. That's the thing that we've struggled with in every neighborhood. So which met the physical criteria and which had actual local support. And so we're going to be moving forward with some additional experiments in the neighborhoods that have been left behind, and click through all that. There was a lot of community process in phase 4.
The fact that, Lane is one example of a slow street in Bayview that didn't work, but do you think that this is also part of the reason why there was such little communication with District 10 and 11? Is it that people just don't seem really interested, or are we not connecting with them in the best way possible? I'm asking because, I'm in this community and a lot of people are still trying to figure out how they feel about a slow street. And this is because we have multi-generational homes. We have multiple cars, the mom, the dad, the aunt, the uncle, the grandmother, grandfather, all living under one household that have different places to be. Though this whole thing is about communities of concern, this is an example of people who are in that situation, with income and other things. And a lot of these people are also essential workers. So they are doing the night jobs and other things. So how do we speak slow streets to people who are living in this community under those conditions?
Exactly. So our first attempt failed because it was, some guy downtown looking like me who thought it would be a good idea, and we tried it, and of course it didn't work. We did learn, however, from the Bayview community-based transportation plan that folks in Southern District 10 are really clear about their values and priorities when you frame the question correctly. And so we need some help in framing slow streets and what exact problem is it trying to solve? We're not hearing from Bayview residents that it's a huge priority to ride around on fancy bikes in spandex. Not a priority. There are real needs in Bayview. That's not high on the list. So what we're starting to hear from community is there are really, really serious concerns about sideshow driving, about speeding in the neighborhoods, about concern fear of kids being able to play safely in the streets, fear of older adults being able to cross the street to get to the corner store or get to church or wherever it is that they're going to the bus stop. So what we're trying to do is to try to reframe the program to see, is this design technique workable? And I think what we've discovered is the answer is no. Another reason the program failed is that a bunch of flimsy science isn't enough to actually solve the real problems, like the stuff that I just listed. So what we're trying to do right now is to expand the toolkit, stuff that is more expensive, a little bit more time consuming to install, and a little bit more permanent, so that we can start doing some experiments of a different approach to slow streets that actually addresses the real priorities of people living in the Ingleside and Bayview and Biz Valley and other neighborhoods that have so far been left underserved.
So the process, if folks want to make slow streets permanent, what would we need to do? Is this another situation similar to the car-free JFK where we reach out to our supervisor, or do we connect with the MTA?
So slow streets are entirely the jurisdiction of MTA. And so the process is a little bit easier. We're also taking, some of the slow streets are more like each other and are clearly successful. So we're doing an incremental approach on permanence. The program itself will likely be permanent, and we'll continue to evolve the toolkit. I don't think we're never going to be done with slow streets. We're going to be continually evolving it. And so from a MTA perspective, the stuff that usually moves the needle with us, one is, member of the Board of Supervisors, being enthusiastic that this is a priority and it actually solves a problem. Similarly with community-based organizations and neighborhood associations. So we can continue to do our generic outreach, and I can send you the link for the Bayview site from what we've heard so far from community, as well as from our own physical assessment, particularly with the fire department, who again is oftentimes the most challenging consideration to deal with, because here in San Francisco, because of this history of the city, we take emergency response very seriously. And so slow streets can sometimes help with emergency response, but if they're not done well, they could result in longer emergency response times, which we don't want to see.
Sorry, something you mentioned struck a chord. You said that what do the people of Bayview, Hunters Point care about? And they often say street safety. And that it's been almost 50 days since Josiah Andrews was killed in the Bayview, and nothing has been done to the street where he was killed. And it would be one thing if it was just him, but 1 year before he was hit and killed, another 12-year-old Black boy on a bright sunny day was hit. He survived, but the thought that at the same spot there could be two children in a year, one died and nothing has changed, that's tough. Why hasn't anything changed there?
So for both of those cases, we did a detailed assessment of the causal factors. Along with every single other severe injury and fatality that happens in San Francisco, we look for patterns where the location and causal factors align. And we allocate nearly 100% of our streets capital budget to safety.
There is a T intersection. The street going into it has no stop sign. It is one of the flattest streets in San Francisco. There are speed bumps, but there's that lack of a stop sign seems quite glaring to me, given that seems to be about or potentially contributory to these incidents. We can't get a stop sign.
Also,
Tilly, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we hear these very, very sad stories, and I know that Jeff's team is very thorough, and that they actually have very rapid response to identify what were the attributable factors. Sometimes it's not even knowable, right? But to the extent that it could be daylighting, it could be a stop sign, it could be speeding, it could be something that was just really a tragic mistake on who knows. There's all kinds of potential explanations. So maybe that's something you guys could look into further, Jeff. But it's a good opportunity, I think, to mention that last year nationally and in San Francisco, we had far, far more crashes involving everyone, but particularly folks on foot and on bike, than ever before. Like, we had a good track record nationally for many years, and it's just popped up 25% during a pandemic. Like, why? And it perhaps could be that people are speeding, that they are thinking that with fewer trips, the volume of traffic is down, that it's a license to speed. So we are imploring everyone to be more aware, and also that MTA is being more proactive in their traffic calming work. But there's also right now a call for traffic calming applications from neighborhoods, so that if there's a problem and that you suspect a stop sign could be helpful, please go to SFMTA's website and apply. It's the right time.
It's just I think this is the thing that is troubling, especially this is, to me, is what our supervisors should be angry about, like that, because I just feel like if that kid had been on the other side of town, or if he had been mine, I wouldn't have stopped until there was a stop sign. I mean, the whole idea that you have to beg or scream or live in a certain neighborhood or be a certain race to get response is troubling. And I just think that more could be done. It seems like a very obvious, I mean, I don't know, but that seems like a glaring oversight on that block. And I'm just shocked that, in fact, this is why we're here almost. I mean, we got to hear the things, but the conversation with Megan started because when I was riding through Bayview on Friday, again, I was just so angry about that nothing had been done there, and everything that I'm running into, it's like, and seeing people racing for the bus and missing it, and no bike lanes and jacked up or non-existent sidewalks. And it just seems like a neighborhood that's been forgotten. And so there is no option. You can't have a slow street there, because everyone does have a car, because they haven't been served by transit, and everything about the place says, don't walk here, don't bike here. And that is, that to me seems like, when we want to talk about equity, make it work for them. Make it work. Go out there. It's like community engagement, go there and make that place feel like the Richmond, the Sunset, Haight-Ashbury, Hayes Valley, at any of these other places that it seems like it's a bit better. That to me feels like it would be equitable, because no one can give up their car until they have something to go to. And we should be working very hard to provide that, I think.
I'd like that two questions about that. One, the first question is, say we do rally to get these stop signs or whatever infrastructure is needed to create a safer street. What is the timeline on that? And how do we advocate to expedite it? So say we go to that street where that youth was hit and unfortunately passed away. And you, Stacy, would like to put a sign there, a stop sign. How long do we think that would take to happen? I know stuff is always changing when it comes to the city, and sometimes it takes longer, but I'm just curious.
So stop signs are really easy. They're also incredibly ineffective. It's the most dangerous form of intersection control. It is oftentimes something we historically have done in order to demonstrate that we're doing something, because the perception is that stop signs enhance safety, even though the data suggests otherwise. In my term, I'm interested in actually solving the underlying problem and using the most effective tools in order to improve safety outcomes, rather than simply throwing up a sign and saying that we've solved the problem. So the challenge is that the more effective solutions are more expensive and take more time, because the more effective solutions require undoing 70 years of street design work that prioritize the convenience of motor vehicle travel over any other consideration. And in many San Francisco neighborhoods, the sidewalks are too narrow, the street is too wide, the intersections are too big. Everything is designed to accommodate motor vehicle speed by design. And stop signs can exacerbate rather than solve the problem. So that's why we do work like the Bayview Community-Based Transportation Plan, so that we can look at the data and the patterns of safety, hear from the community about their priorities, and then develop a capital investment program that checks off every single street in order. And that's why we're going out on Saturday to celebrate a complete reconfiguration of Hunters Point Boulevard and Innis, using community-based artists in a low cost, well, it's sort of a medium cost kind of way, in that the infrastructure is more quick build. It's not temporary, but it's quick build, because a permanent rebuilding of that street would be tens of millions of dollars that we don't have. And yet, in our capital improvement program, we're redirecting the bulk of our resources, both capital and operating, to our so-called equity neighborhoods. That includes all of Southern District 10 and much of D11, as well as places like Chinatown. Bayview is the only neighborhood in San Francisco where transit access is significantly better now than it was pre-COVID. The 15 Express takes a trip from Hunters Point that used to take well over an hour and is now 20 minutes to get downtown. We've expanded the number of jobs accessible within a 45-minute transit commute by over 55% to Bayview and Hunters Point residents. So, we are doing everything we can with our dramatically curtailed resources to redirect those resources to places that need it the most. And if you think you all are feeling neglected now, you should hear the complaints that I get from the wealthiest neighborhoods, because we've stripped most investments away from them. I cut the most transit from the wealthy neighborhoods. A lot of it's not coming back. We have no path to bring back a dozen transit lines. And that is predominantly in the most affluent neighborhoods. And we're not spending a lot of money on our capital side in places that are nice. And I am yelled at every single day by very wealthy people who are trying to get me fired because I'm spending money in places that need it the most.
Then maybe they should pay more.
That's a whole other conversation. And that's right. I saw somebody yelling at you at Golden Gate Park when I was coming to say hi. So he's not lying. They come for him. Here's a question from the audience. In terms of response times in the SF Fire Department and SF Fire Department Union and their opposition to car light spaces, the vast majority of their membership lives outside of San Francisco. How can we make roads with this department that piggybacks on their general popularity and shiny image in SF?
I'll take that one. So I do want to emphasize that San Francisco has a unique history with fire. The city has burned. There are, not just in 1906, but there's been major fires throughout San Francisco's history. We're a city of wooden buildings. And so emergency response is in San Francisco's blood. What we're trying to do is to modernize our approach to emergency response time. And that means really, as an agency, owning the responsibility for managing the streets so that fire trucks and ambulances can get through quickly. And that means doing things like transit-only lanes that fire trucks and police cars and ambulances can use. It also means co-designing with the fire department, design techniques that work for slow streets that also accommodate primary emergency response. During COVID, we've been incapable of doing field trips because we can't all bundle into a fire truck or a van together and drive down to the Stanford campus or go to Berkeley and look at approaches that other jurisdictions have done in order to create great streets for people and for commerce and for outdoor seating, and that also really accommodate fire engines. Fire chiefs are extremely conservative because they operate in a live or die environment. And a few seconds makes a difference between saving the house and saving the children versus having all that burn. So as with all things where there's a dispute, the best starting place is compassion. The best starting place is understanding, all right, what is your perspective? Okay, this is what you prioritize. Got it. So how can we not pit fire safety against traffic safety, but instead look at public safety holistically? And that requires building trust. It requires going on field trips, and it requires doing testing in the streets, all of which we're eager to do once we can finally actually sit down with each other on a street in a fire engine.
Okay, I got another question here. I requested a stop sign for a scary intersection at Polk and Greenwich. It was a four-way intersection with stop signs on 2 of 4 ways. Some thought it was a four-way stop and didn't yield. Some honking in near misses of drivers. SFMTA didn't want to slow down the 19 bus. Stop sign went in 2 years later. Is this the perception of safety versus actual safety? How to reduce collisions, keep convenience for walking/biking, and speed up buses? Sorry, yeah, how can we reduce? I think he's trying to.
I love the perception of safety versus actual safety thing. So this is super important in our industry. Is like I operate in an Alice in Wonderland kind of world where the perception of danger is the opposite of the actuality of danger. When we look at the actual crash statistics, and particularly where there are injuries and fatalities, it's oftentimes in locations that people perceive to be relatively safe. And the places that are scariest and most horrible and awful oftentimes have a very good safety record. And it's not to say that one is more important than the other, because in fact, we make our travel decisions based largely on our perceptions, not based on the data. And stop signs are very much caught up in this perception versus reality debate. And particularly on a primary transit corridor, if we put a stop sign at every single intersection, you're never going to be able to have transit be time competitive with driving. It would kill Muni. And so what we try to do is projects like we've done on Geary, during COVID, and also on Haight Street during COVID, which is replacing stop signs with traffic signals, and then synchronizing the lights for to optimize the flow of buses. We've also done things on Erie that include queue jump lanes. So where we don't have a transit only lane on Erie, the bus has a special signal that allows it to jump in front of the queue when the road narrows, when there's diagonal parking in the commercial district. So this is like the many variables that we try to juggle as an agency is, we need Muni to be reasonably fast and reliable. Stop signs prevent that. We also need it to both be safe and feel safe to cross the street as a pedestrian or in a wheelchair. And stop signs also, have not the best track record in terms of the actuality of pedestrian safety. Every street in San Francisco is unique because our geography is crazy, and the needs vary depending upon, the relative level of importance of each mode relative to the other. So we take streets that have very high frequency Muni service, like we care a lot more about intersection delay on Mission Street than we do on Clement Street.
Okay, I have another question for you from the audience. It says, Director Tumlin has said basically that he's supposed to make compromises to make everybody unhappy. But why should we make everybody unhappy when we have overall priorities? From the transit first policy to the climate emergency, I'm pretty sure solutions that match the claim principles will make some people happy and others unhappy.
So this is a joke that I oftentimes make because 95% of the communication that I get in my email inbox or out on the street is people complaining about something and saying that I'm a horrible person. So for all of our decision making, we try to start with our values. We have a value that we need to use our limited street right of way in order to maximize the movement of people and goods. But at the same time, we need to prioritize those with the greatest needs and the fewest choices. Similarly, we have a value around safety. Obviously, we have a value around the fact that the transportation sector is 45% of San Francisco's greenhouse gas emissions and the only sector that is growing. And we are in a seaside city that if we expect it to be survivable, we have to play our part in rapidly decarbonizing the transport sector. So we try to start with our values and we try to start with adopted policy. But we also operate in the most conservative city that I have ever worked in my entire career, and I've worked in hundreds of cities around the world. San Francisco has progressive values when looking outward. When looking inward, we are deeply afraid of change, in part because many of us are from someplace else. We fell in love with the city as it was when we first arrived here, and we're terrified that any change is going to damage that image of the city that we hold so dear in our hearts. So this is a city in which change is really difficult and in which the politics tend to diverge to the extreme. For example, JFK. Again, the question with JFK is not take it back exactly as it was or leave it exactly as it is. The question should be, how do we optimize access to this magnificent resource? So what I've been trying to do in my work is to reframe the question and to have more discussions, more civil discussions, Megan, just like you're hosting here. And that is hard given the pace of change that is necessary in order to address the economic shifts, climate change, and the safety problems that we've got in San Francisco that require immediate action.
Thank you so much for that. I keep freezing. Well, we are getting close to the end of this conversation. I want to give us the opportunity just to talk a little bit about how we're going to continue doing this outreach and connecting with outer, communities that are further out from some of these major initiatives like the Great Highway and JFK. I think that there's very different cultures of people who appreciate these parks. It's more than the color of our skin. It's cyclists, it's drivers, it's people who are transit first. But ultimately, there needs to be some sort of understanding between all these different cultures. And we need to come together and figure out a way to work together. I agree with you, Director Tumlin, that we need to increase access to Golden Gate Park if the plan is to keep it open or closed. Excuse me, I'm trying to get that part right. So hopefully, with this, we'll see solutions like potential shuttles, maybe some partnerships with some of the micromobility companies, all different types of avenues to connect us better to JFK. But what do you think? Just what are your final thoughts in terms of how to build more of a coalition between all these different cultures? How can we work together better?
Start with compassion, start with listening.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And understand that not everyone can have the luxury of participating in the traditional formal ways. And that's an incumbency on all of us at on the agency side, to be more creative, kind of spend the time out there, be hands-on, get in the community, go to folks where they are as much as possible, and do try, I think, to make every effort to at least enable folks to have the opportunity to engage. So that's a good ideal. We're not there yet by far. There's a lot of work to do, but I'd say that we are very, very committed. I know Jeff is as well, and our teams are very committed to working with communities on all the different ways that are appropriate, culturally appropriate, as well to connect. Yeah. So thank you, and we really appreciate these types of forums. Thank you, Megan and Stacy.
Absolutely. I mean, this is only the beginning. There's many more conversations to be had. I would say also to people who are tuning in, if you want to connect with community about some of these closures, for one, you should join us this Saturday at India Basin. What is it? Some Saturday Streets?
Saturday Streets.
Yeah, Saturday. This is hosted by Little Bull City, and we're going to be at Indian Basin. We'll get a chance to check out that wonderful art project that's been done with artists from the community. I will drop the link to that event in the event section within Hearsay's event Facebook page. You'll see what I mean when I put it there. I know that was a lot. Second, get to know your neighbors. What are people saying? Talk to them instead of going on Twitter and yelling at them. Go talk to them in person, or give them a call, or send them an email, something. But don't put them on blast. Just talk to them. And then finally, if you do have questions, look at different advocacy groups that focus specifically on these things. Talk to the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. Talk to the SF Transit Riders. Talk to folks like Stacy, who host amazing Clubhouse conversations around this. But you can only do that if you have an iPhone. We all figured that out earlier, right?
Yeah, bummer. Yeah.
And then finally, connect with your district supervisor. If you feel so strongly about any of these initiatives, whether you're for or against, then talk to your city council person and see what they have to say. Because ultimately, this is a community-led process. We should all be telling our city what they want, what we want, not the other way around. And I think this is, the beginning of that. So, Stacy, you want to add anything before we wrap this up?
No, just to thank you, Megan, for hosting this. I so appreciate your piece that you did and being open and receptive to all of us who are looking for more guidance. Because while we're both D10 bike girls, our D10s are a little different. So I just so appreciate you. So thank you for hosting all of us for this talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Everybody go get a nice ice cold glass of water because it is hot. All right. Everyone have a good night. Thank you so much. And keep in touch. Yeah, there you go.
Bye all.